Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for many months, the Trump administration has unleashed a campaign of fear across American cities, deploying thousands of immigration agents onto our streets and into our neighborhoods in an effort to terrorize and punish communities. In Chicago, Portland, Los Angeles, and most recently Minneapolis, we have watched mass federal agents in unmarked cars snatch people from the street, destroy private property, and leave others bloodied on the side of the road. We've witnessed an approach to internal immigration enforcement which no president in our history has pursued, that no president would ever have conceived, because of how fundamentally it violates our principles and the rule of law. We've witnessed children separated from their parents, a 5-year-old detained by armed agents in Minnesota, people pulled from their cars, their engines still running. All of us have read reports of people grabbed off the sidewalk and abandoned hours later, miles away. And every step along the way, Donald Trump's immigration troops have escalated tension on our streets, with total disregard for the rule of law, basic safety, and their own accountability. These events would be terrible enough, but even as communities across the country have struggled to pick up the pieces left in their wake, we've been forced to contend with another injustice, an administration that has tried to convince us time and time again that what we have seen with our own eyes is not the truth, that somehow the opposite has taken place, that reports and testimony contradicting the administration's position are simply political propaganda. Over and over again, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and others in the administration have lied to the American people and to Congress about what we are all seeing in plain sight. And now they're lying to justify the murder of Alex Pretti. Right after the shooting of Alex Pretti in the street, Noem went on national television and told us that Alex was brandishing a firearm, quote, impeding the law enforcement officers and attacking them, and that he, quote, acted violently or reacted violently when officers attempted to disarm him. She insisted that, quote, an agent fired defensive shots, and that it appeared that this was, quote, a situation where an individual arrived at the scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and kill law enforcement. Stephen Miller, who works at the White House, called Alex a, quote, domestic terrorist and a, quote, would-be assassin. Vice President J.D. Vance amplified these statements. Gregory Bovino, a senior Border Patrol official who is serving, quote, as commander-at-large, maintained that Alex had intended to, quote, massacre law enforcement agents. At a press conference, Bonino turned the facts completely upside down, insisting that the victims of Saturday's violence were the Border Patrol agents that were there. Bovino, by the way, has served as the face of the administration's operations as they have swept through America's cities. In Chicago, and Charlotte, and New Orleans, and then Minneapolis. The American people deserve to know the truth. And Alex Pretti and his family deserve to have the truth told about him and what he did. Thanks to a number of courageous bystanders at the scene, we know what happened that day. And we know that everything that Noem and Miller and others have said have been lies. The truth is that Alex put himself between federal agents and a woman they were shoving in the street. He had been filming Border Patrol agents detaining someone else on the side of the road when he went to help this woman. The officers responded by pepper spraying him and wrestling him to the ground, where he was quickly surrounded by a group of 7 agents. They struck him repeatedly with the pepper spray canister while he lay in the street. One officer took away his gun, a gun that had remained holstered and that Alex was legally allowed to carry. Then disarmed and incapacitated, they shot him in his back. They shot him at least 10 times within 5 seconds. Alex Pretti was killed by his own government. And then his government immediately began to lie about him and what had happened. He did not attack the agents. He did not threaten them, and at no point did he pull a gun. In the video of that horrific scene, it's clear that an agent disarmed him before any shots were fired. Multiple agents held him to the ground. 3 of them beat him. No reasonable person would have believed he posed any threat to the agents or anyone else at the scene. But the agents still shot him. They shot him 10 times. In the days since his murder, we've learned a lot more about Alex from those who knew him and loved him. Alex was a dedicated ICU nurse at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Minneapolis. His colleagues described him there as helpful and kind, and that he was uniquely capable of handling things with integrity and with grace. His high school classmates remember him as a role model. They recalled him being a really good friend and a really good man. Alex loved his country, and like many of us, he was deeply concerned about the Trump administration's actions and the devastating effect they are having on our democracy. It is true that he had very strong feelings about the presence of ICE on his city's streets. But the day he was killed, Alex was exercising his First Amendment rights to peacefully protest and document the actions of federal agents as they threatened his community. Alex's parents, Michael and Susan, live in Colorado. They want the world to know the truth about what happened that day and the truth about the kind of son, the kind of person their son really was. They told the world that Alex wanted to make a difference in the world. His patients and colleagues, friends and family testified to the fact that he did. And it is another tragedy that he will no longer be able to continue to do so. But Alex's murder is only the most recent outrage we've been subjected to by a reckless and out-of-control DHS. On January 7th, federal agents shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis. Renee was a mother of 3 and a native of Colorado Springs. The next day, federal agents shot and wounded 2 people in Portland. A week later, federal agents shot and wounded another man again in Minneapolis. It's worth remembering that these are just a few of the instances that have occurred in broad daylight and in public spaces where bystanders have been there, Mr. President, to witness these brutal activities firsthand and managed to capture video of what happened. But if this is what's happening out in the open, it's hard to imagine what is happening behind closed doors. Last year, 32 people died in ICE custody. That's the most in over 20 years, Mr. President. Given the total lack of transparency and accountability that we've seen from ICE, we can't be sure what's happened to these people. There have been reports about sexual abuse of detainees. There are disputed facts over deaths that occurred in ICE custody. People in ICE facilities have reportedly been forced to ration food. They often go days or weeks without their prescription medicines, Mr. President, or access to medical care. Overcrowded detention facilities leave the lights on 24/7. And families report extreme violence and intimidation by guards. These stories are consistent from people held in detention across the country, including in the detention facility in Aurora, Colorado. But the administration has lied about all of this. President Trump has claimed that Renee Good was a, quote, professional agitator, that she was very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, then violently and willfully and viciously ran over the ICE officer. Noam described Good's efforts to leave the scene peacefully as an act of domestic terrorism. Her department issued a statement saying that, quote, a violent rioter had weaponized her vehicle. In October, Noam and her department lied when she said no U.S. citizens had been arrested, detained, or deported. In November, federal judge Sarah Ellis described Gregory Bovino as evasive, not credible, and declared that he was, quote, outright lying when questioned under oath. A consistent pattern of lies corrodes Americans' faith in our government, which is already stretched dangerously thin. It strikes at the core of our constitutional system, which requires at least some basic level, some basic fidelity to facts in the conduct of our public affairs and our public discourse. When the Secretary of Homeland Security appears on television to insist repeatedly on her preferred version of events, she's not just offering another lie that must be rebutted. She's insisting that there could never be a truth that actually mattered to the American people or to our sense of public safety or to our exercise in self-government. And that is what's at stake here, Mr. President. If we allow this to continue, we risk falling into a degraded version of political debate when there are so many lies and so many contested facts that the American people regard any claim with exhausted cynicism and suspicion. And if we go too far down that path, and we're headed a long way down it right now, the only guaranteed outcome will be greater contempt felt by Americans for their government and for the political process. They will withdraw from public life and the possibility for genuine political disagreement. In other words, a debate over what to do in the face of facts, rather than over the facts themselves. We're unwilling to even have a discussion about it because of our permanent partisan division will be erased. Every one of us has a responsibility at a moment like this. And we know from American history that in some ways, the most significant resistance in moments like this comes from the public itself. It comes from the people of this country. I could see that on the steps and the grounds of the state capitol in Colorado last weekend when thousands of Coloradans were there to rally not just for themselves, but for their fellow citizens in Minnesota and across our country. I think when times are tough, we often have a tendency to think that we're living in uniquely bad times. But I believe that way of thinking almost always does a disservice to the people who have come before us, who took on even tougher battles with longer odds, and who, while they were doing that, and because they were doing that, bequeathed to us their own legacy of resistance and the possibility of change, no matter how hard it seemed. And I think we should look to those battles for inspiration in our time. And it's important for us to tell our kids about those battles, to make sure they understood what those fights actually looked like and how hopeless at times those fights seemed to the people that were waging them. When I was growing up, and I know this is true for many of my colleagues who are here, the moral character of this country was defined by the civil rights movement, the struggle against segregation and the fight for equality. This fight, this battle, the effort to demolish centuries of legalized discrimination and disenfranchisement never was going to be easy, and many believed that it was nearly impossible. And there were others who believed that it shouldn't have been fought to begin with. And I would say to this day, we have a long, long way to go. The structure of Jim Crow, of the poll tax, of separate and worse schoolrooms and hospital wards and lunch counters had been built up over generations. State laws had established these exclusionary practices. State officials enforced them and state courts upheld them. There was no guarantee that they would ever come crashing down. But they did, because the leaders of the civil rights movement and ordinary citizens in the streets and in America's pulpits, and reporters, journalists sent to report on the demonstrations and the conditions of real life in the South of this country, made it impossible to ignore the facts. It was harder then than it is in our own time just to turn the channel and imagine that alternate reality didn't actually exist. People in that country, with the broadcasters, ABC and CBS and NBC, it was impossible for the public to ignore what was right before their eyes. The success of that generation of brave Americans was achieved because they forced a broad swath of this country, a majority of this country, to finally see what they would have been preferred to be blind to: the reality of segregation and the subordination of their fellow citizens under law. It is a story of moral reckoning and of citizen action. It is a story of street protests and police brutality and political vacillation, but it's also a story of American renewal, of our ability to author our own history, to continue the endless founding and refounding of this country as generations of Americans lay claim to it and shape it. I don't believe that we've lost that ability. I don't believe that we've lost that ambition. I don't believe that people in Colorado and Minnesota and all across this country have given up on the promise offered by America, a promise that can only be given and kept to each other. As Alex Pretti said himself when honoring a veteran who died in his care, today we remember that freedom is not free. We have to work at it, nurture it, protect it, and even sacrifice for it. In the end, it's also not enough for there to be just public expressions or disapproval. We actually have to change the laws. Part of our job here as senators is to uphold the ideals that Alex and so many others in Minnesota and across Colorado and across the country believe in and are fighting for. And it's our job here in the Senate to provide a check on an executive who our founders knew was always susceptible to the temptations of unlimited power. That was their concern about a unitary executive, the President of the United States. And this week we have an opportunity to be that check. We have an opportunity to change the law. The Senate, Mr. President, is considering a number of bills to fund the government, including one that provides over $10 billion to the very department that's responsible for the murder of Alex Pretti and the chaos we are seeing in communities across the country. It would be unconscionable for us to pass this bill without amending how ICE or the Border Patrol operate at all. In fact, we should use this as an opportunity to do it. What better opportunity will there be? As written, the Homeland Appropriations Bill provides no real accountability, no oversight, no guardrails or transparency. It offers no guarantee at all that what happened to Alex Pretti won't happen again. And that's all the more absurd, Mr. President, because Republicans gave the Department of Homeland Security an additional $190 billion on top of the regular annual appropriations. Think about that. $190 billion additional dollars on top of the annual appropriations last year as part of their big, beautiful bill that they passed on a partisan vote. And this funding, I can assure you, came with no accountability or oversight at all. In the midst of all this, it would be a profound abdication of our responsibility as senators to entertain the idea of providing more funding to the department unless serious reforms are put in place. And I think that these reforms are common sense that you'd want for any law enforcement agency operating in America. But especially when it comes to a federal agency operating in some sense now as the president's internal army. I think the least we could ask is that children are no longer detained or stripped from their families. Who wants to come to this floor and say and debate the opposite of that point? Immigration officers should take off their masks and provide clear identification. There is no doubt in my mind that the minute we get through this fraught political moment in America, there will be a broad consensus. In fact, I think there is one now, that ICE shouldn't be separating children from their families, that law enforcement agents shouldn't be wearing masks, that they should use body cameras consistently with any immigration enforcement activities, and that ICE stays away from sensitive areas like schools and hospitals and places of worship. And, consistent with our responsibility, our duty to provide a check, to provide our own oversight, that members of Congress have full access to immigration detention facility. Those are reforms that do not today define the way ICE does its work. They do define the way a lot of our local law enforcement does its work. But I think they reflect a massive consensus in the country about what would fix the challenges that we're facing. It would at least be a basic start in the right direction. In my view, he might disagree, but in my view, President Trump would be doing himself and the country a favor if he removed Kristi Noem from her position and prevented her from doing any more harm to this country and to our communities. And if he removed DHS agents from Minnesota and other cities across our country. And I would say to all of my colleagues here, Republicans and Democrats, that we cannot simply accept a promise of change or action or reform from this administration, which has spent months lying to Congress and the American people with a straight face. There is no world where we can sit back and assume that the president and his team are going to be persuaded to do anything, unless we write it into law. And even then, we have no guarantee, of course, that this administration won't just break the law as soon as it's written. That's been our experience in Colorado, Mr. President. But at least putting this into statute would be a better pathway for holding Noem and Miller and others accountable for the bloodshed and chaos that we're seeing in our streets. After that, I think we could have serious conversations about passing a funding bill. Until then, we can't allow this legislation to go forward. Our children and future generations have a reasonable expectation that their elected officials will do everything in their power to keep them safe and to provide the plain facts as they are. As legislators, it's our responsibility to stand up to an executive branch that is unleashing mayhem in our streets and gunning down American citizens, while insisting that the public should not believe what they have seen and what they have heard, or that it's unpatriotic all of a sudden to disagree with the president's version of events. We've seen this story before. There is nothing new under the sun. We know the dark path this can lead us down. But we've also seen the courage that is demonstrated by the generations of Americans that have come before us that have disagreed in this chamber, that have disagreed with each other, but who ultimately have rejected injustice, and particularly when it was directed from the highest levels of government. One of these people was a hero of mine. It won't surprise anybody here to know that it was Colorado's former governor, Ralph Carr, who spoke out against Japanese internment when most politicians in the West and in this country were staying silent. Addressing a crowd one day on the eastern plains of Colorado, Governor Carr said, quote, "I am talking to all American people, whether their status be white, brown, or black, when I say that if a majority may deprive a minority of its freedom, contrary to the terms of the Constitution today, then you as a minority may be subjected to the same ill will of the majority tomorrow." What happened to Alex Pretti and the lies that followed was an assault on every one of us, on all of our children, on our sense of dignity and our innate understanding of right and wrong. Now is the time for my colleagues to come together and demand that we reassert these principles and demand the return of safety and security and sanity to our government, rather than the chaos and destruction that we have recently seen. It's what all Americans expect, Mr. President, and it is what our country deserves. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.